Hello, Dr. Raymer here, and today we're talking about movement and the changing senses. And while the chapter talks about multiple senses and how all of the senses impact movement, we're really going to focus on vision. So the interaction between the developmental domains is really a theme of this course. And not surprisingly then, development of the senses critically influences all of the other domains. How the senses influence motor development and motor performance represents an example here between the physical domains and the motor domains. But as you'll see, and we'll allude to it a little bit in this lecture, there's an impact between the senses and all of the other domains of development. Now, our ability to move within our environment and interact with our environment and the objects and people in it depends critically on integration of motor commands with sensory inputs. And that's represented here in this overlapping schematic. And so we have sensory inputs entering from the periphery. We have motor commands emerging centrally. And then at the interaction of these, we have what's called perception. And perception is more than just detection of sensory input. Perception involves the integration and interpretation of that sensory input. So everything we go to do, from typing on a keyboard to throwing and catching a ball to shaking someone's hand, involves an interaction between sensory input, the perception of it, and elicitation of motor commands. And the action that's produced is at the center of these three neural mechanisms, representing an integration of each. Now, while all senses influence motor development and motor performance, vision plays a particularly important role. When we think about motor development and movement in terms of vision, we think about a few things. Firstly, most movement tasks are initiated because we receive visual input. We see something or someone we want to move toward or interact with or physically respond to. During movement, vision also provides crucial feedback to allow us to adjust and respond, and that optimizes movement in the moment. And finally, in terms of motor learning, vision allows us to emulate the movements of others, and this is particularly crucial in terms of motor development. Now, one of the ways we measure or quantify the interaction between vision and motor development is through something called visual motor integration. And this is the ability to coordinate visual perception and motor coordination. So this is one of the tests of visual motor coordination here. Each of these initials in each column represents 5 typically developing children. And what they're being asked to do is to draw a house. Now, their ages are shown in brackets underneath their little drawings here, and their drawing attempts. And so you can see they're between about 4 and 6 years old. Now, if you ask a 4-year-old to draw a house, you kind of get something that does not look recognizable as a house. This one seems maybe a rocket ship. This one's sort of like a blob, maybe a face. So it's very difficult to detect that that is a house. They see a house, you're showing them the house, but they don't have the significant visual motor integration required to reproduce that on paper themselves. You can see most kids around 5 sort of fall in an intermediate stage. Maybe if you show them a typical stereotypical house, they can produce something that looks maybe like a building, so it's recognizable. They've got the basic schema of a house. When most kids hit about 6, and again, you can see the variability in this, then you get something that's a recognizable house. Someone else who's looking at the drawing can say, oh yeah, that's a house. And that's an example of visual motor integration at work, the ability to see something and reproduce it through motor output. Now, when we talk about development of vision, we have to start, obviously, at the eye. And many of us have sort of an idea of how the eye works, but we'll review it just briefly so we're all looking at the same thing, if you'll forgive the pun. So we started our cute little doggy here. This is our vision of the world, and light from objects enters the eye via the pupil. That's what admits the light to the eye, and of course it impinges upon a lens. That lens refracts the light, bends it to focus it posteriorly here on the retina. And on the retina, which is the sense organ, we get an inverted image of the world. Now, fortunately, the brain reinverts that image, so we don't walk around looking at the world upside down. Within the retina, that light strikes photoreceptors, so these specialized cells, rods and cones, that then send information to the brain to reconstruct the image in the primary visual cortex. Now, in terms of development of the eye and how that affects vision and motor development, we have to focus on two things. The first is that the eyes contain a lens, and that lens can change in thickness to accommodate near and far vision. And the second is two sets of muscles that govern eye function. The first set are muscles that move the eye. So these are represented here. You can see they're striated little tiny muscles. They're attached to the eyeball and they move the eye in the orbit or the eye socket. So if you look left, right, up, down, you are using those little muscles. And so those muscles, because I just did that volitionally, we know they're under some volitional control. They're also under reflexive control. So if you snap, you will inadvertently orient your eyes toward a sound in the periphery. And so that's a reflexive movement of those muscles. But you can also volitionally move them. The other name for those muscles, because on the outside of the eye, is the extraocular muscles. So you'll hear them called extraocular. These are these little muscles that pull the eye around in the eye socket. Conversely, the muscles that govern the diameter of the pupil and the thickness of this lens are under autonomic control. So there's little muscles here at the edge of the pupil and at the edge of the lens, and they're autonomically controlled. So we can't control those volitionally. Now, one of those autonomically controlled muscles are the ciliary muscles. One set. These are the little muscles that govern the thickness of the lens in the eye. When you're looking at something in the distance, you're out for a hike, you're looking at the horizon off the top of a mountain, for example, the ciliary muscles are relaxed. The lens, correspondingly, gets flatter and more broad, and that changes the focal length of the lens. So these little arrows pointing out here represent what the lens is doing. It's stretching out in the relaxed eye. The ciliary muscles are relaxed, and that is the eye optimized for distance vision. When you bring something in close, like a computer screen or your smartphone, then you accommodate for near vision. And what happens in accommodation is that those ciliary muscles contract, and that crystalline lens that focuses light on the retina becomes thicker and more rounded. And that changes the focal length of the eye. So accommodation is optimizing the eye for near vision. So when you see an eye that's accommodated, it's accommodating something up close. When you get eye fatigue, part of the reason is fatigue in these ciliary muscles. They are contracted for long periods of time when you're doing up-close work. So one way to rest your eyes is to go look at something in the distance and unload those little muscles governing the thickness of the lens. Now, the eye is an outgrowth of the forebrain. And like the brain, a considerable amount of eye growth happens prenatally, but not all of it. So here, if you look at an adult eye at the top, look at the diameter, and compare that to an infant eye at the bottom, you can see that the infant eye is a little bit short on this dimension from lens to retina in comparison. And for that reason, because of the different position of the lens, that distance lens to retina, infants are a little bit hyperopic or farsighted at birth. Now, what does that mean? Well, hyperopia is farsighted, means you have clear distance vision. So you're looking at this tree, looks lovely and clear in the distance. But if you hold an apple up close, it's a bit blurry. So that's what farsighted means. So all infants are intrinsically a bit farsighted, but they compensate through accommodation. So they can achieve clarity of vision even over the months after birth while their eye is still growing. Now, in addition to being born a little bit hyperopic, babies are born with very little vision and visual acuity or clarity at all. So the eye develops physically and structurally. All the structures are there prenatally, but all the input arrives postnatally. Remember that babies are growing up in the dark, in the uterus, and so they have very little visual input at all. So what happens postnatally, all this, they're bombarded with visual input, and there's dramatic changes and improvements in vision over the first 1 to 3 years of life. There's lots of these visual representations about what babies see. Of course, everything is our best estimate. It's very difficult to ask a 1-month-old baby to describe what they're seeing. But there's different tests people have devised, what babies pay attention to preferentially and what they ignore. And this gives us some clues about how babies' vision changes over the first year to 3 years of life. Now, if we look at this timeline, from what we already know, we can see that these changes in vision accompany attainment of motor milestones in early postnatal life, like putting the head up from a prone position, sitting unassisted, standing, creeping, crawling, walking. And so all of these correspond with the development of postnatal vision. Here, one of the most important things that baby sees is the face, particularly a face of a primary caregiver, and that increases in clarity over early postnatal life. Similarly, infants develop better visual acuity, which we'll define in a moment, and improved color resolution. So this is an estimate of what a newborn might see of this toy. And then over weeks, postnatally, you can see it a little bit better. 6 months, you can see it pretty well, but what's missing between a 6-month-old and an adult or even an older child is some visual acuity and some color perception. Babies are born with more rods than cones, and gradually the adult complement of cones develops postnatally, which is what confers those color-sensitive visual receptors, confer that improved color resolution over time. So postnatally, the development of selected visual traits and skilled motor performance interact. And so we're going to talk about, there's 2 that I'd like to focus on, 2 of these postnatal changes in visual attributes, namely visual acuity and binocular vision and depth perception. So visual acuity describes the level of detail we're able to distinguish, and it's almost always expressed as distance visual acuity, which is why I put distance in brackets here. So distance visual acuity is the ability to distinguish detail at a given distance. It's one of the most recognizable aspects of visual testing is an eye chart like this. This is the Snellen eye chart. Snellen came up with it in the late 1800s or so. And it measures distance visual acuity, and it's expressed in fractional notation. So it compares visual acuity to a typical person. So somebody who has 20/20 vision can distinguish the level of detail at 20 feet that a typical person sees at 20 feet. And so that's represented by this line on the Snellen eye chart. If you stand 20 feet away from it, you should be able to read these letters reliably if you have 20/20 vision. Conversely, 20/100 vision, a person with that level of vision, visual acuity, can see the level of detail at 20 feet that a typical person sees at 100 feet. And so that person has much less visual acuity. 20/100, a person has abnormal or reduced visual acuity. The Snellen eye chart is the classic way to measure visual acuity. There's now a huge variety of apps and software that can be used to improve this. And that's particularly important for children, right? Children may not have the attention span or the knowledge of the alphabet to reliably use a Snellen eye chart. And so there's other more interesting ways now that we measure visual acuity, particularly in children. Now, if you haven't had an eye test recently, you might not know what your visual acuity is. Visual acuity measures vision relative to a typical or average person. Diopters measures the power of corrective lenses. So many of us are familiar with our diopter measurement. Just to give you a sense of my own visual acuity, or lack thereof, my diopter measurements are -9.5 and -11. So without my corrective lenses, I'm essentially useless. Now there's a relationship, obviously, between diopters, which is the power of corrective lenses you require to attain 20/20 vision, and between your visual acuity. And so this is sort of a table. If someone tells you, oh, my glasses are -1, then they probably have sort of visual acuity in the 20/40 zone. So they can see at 20 feet what a typical person could see at 40 feet, for example. This relationship sort of starts to fall apart. That's what the asterisks mean. They're rough estimates. It starts to fall apart as we move down in visual acuity because there's a lot of variability across individuals. But I just present this because many people have to, buy contacts and glasses routinely, so they're familiar with their diopter measure, but maybe not with their actual visual acuity score. I should mention that you can also have better than normal visual acuity. So for example, if you're down here on the eye chart, you would have 20/10 vision. And that means that you can see at 20 feet what a typical person can see at 10 feet. So you actually have better than normal visual acuity. I was born legally blind without my glasses, and my sister was born with 20/10 visual acuity. So that's extremely annoying for me. So if we return to this representation of what babies see, visual acuity at birth has been estimated in sort of the 20/200 to 20/400 range. So pretty low. By about 6 months of age, visual acuity is improved in most kids to 20/50 or 20/200, somewhere in that zone. By 18 months, 20/40 to 20/100 vision, so still not perfect, but improving dramatically over this time. And in most kids, if they're going to achieve 20/20 vision, it's achieved by about 3 months of age. And so when kids, 3 years of age, 3 years. So when most kids hit 3 or 4, when they're at the age when they're starting school, if they're not approaching 20/20 visual acuity, that's considered at least evidence of a visual impairment. Dynamic visual acuity, which is visual acuity dealing with objects where you're moving and the object's moving. I'll back up. This chart measures static visual acuity. Nothing's moving. You're standing still, you're looking at a static target. So all of these measurements to date here, we're talking about static visual acuity. Dynamic visual acuity is more complicated, and so it develops long beyond 3 years of age. And dynamic visual acuity is you're moving and what you're looking at is moving. So much more integration required in the brain. And so for that reason, it continues to develop until about age 15, and it peaks at around age 20. So obviously static visual acuity and dynamic visual acuity are related, but dynamic visual acuity is a more complex neurological process. Now, it's very interesting to think about how something like visual acuity affects motor performance. And in an effort to determine this, people have looked at visual acuity in different populations of professional athletes. Now, one of the most dramatic studies of this has been in professional baseball players. And this is a study performed, I think it was actually 93 to 96. This is a modified graph, but over 3 or 4 years on 387 players in the LA Dodgers. And they looked at distance visual acuity just in those players over that time period and found that 80% of players in that time period had a visual acuity of 20/15 or higher. So better than 20/20 vision. Very few of the players had visual acuity that was worse than 20/20. We've talked about constraints on motor performance, so I would argue that this suggests that visual acuity really represents a constraint on motor performance. And if we're talking about just distance visual acuity at baseline, that may be a non-modifiable constraint. Now, interestingly, the second part of the title of this slide talks about more recent data. So the first part refers to the study in the 1990s. The second part talks about research that's a little more recent. Visual acuity actually seems to predict performance in professional baseball. I'm missing an in there. In professional baseball. And so visual acuity may now be integrated, and I don't know if it already has been. It's been suggested that it should be as part of things like scouting for professional athletes. So it's an interesting conversation, isn't it? What are these limits that are imposed on motor potential that may be non-modifiable, and how much should we take them into consideration in assessing someone's performance in a sport? Now, as we age, we're at increased risk of all sorts of age-related eye diseases, so abbreviated ARED, age-related eye disease, that can impact and degrade visual acuity. And glaucoma, cataracts, diabetic retinopathy, and presbyopia are all important components of this. Presbyopia is the need for reading glasses, the loss of near vision that happens as a part of normal aging. So that's what that is. We'll talk about age-related macular degeneration in a little tiny bit of detail as it's becoming increasingly prevalent and a really, really important component of health and aging. So this visual simulation looks at healthy vision or normal vision, that's a scene in normal vision, compared to what someone with different age-related eye diseases might see. And we can see that the presentation is a little bit different, but in terms of macular degeneration, it's really selective loss of the center of the visual field. So the macula is the central portion of the retina, and there's sort of two terms. The macula is the larger region, and it contains the fovea, which is a small pit in the center of the macula. Now, the fovea contains a huge concentration, in fact, exclusively cone cells, so crucially mediates detailed color vision. The macula as a whole really helps us, gives us the detail, I'm lisping, of objects that are right in front of us. And so macular degeneration then produces images where we lose detail, particularly color resolution, and the images of subjects in the center of our visual field, objects that are right in front of us, so I'm losing my pen, are particularly affected. So macular degeneration is one of the most common forms of age-related eye disease, and it's really two separate conditions, so it occurs in two forms. Both involve macular degeneration, but the pathology and the progression is quite different. So one is dry macular degeneration. That's by far the most common. It's about 90% of the cases of macular degeneration in the population. The less common but more severe form is called wet macular degeneration. It's about 10% of the cases, but about 90% of the cases that result in blindness are from wet macular degeneration. And so just a couple of things to look at here. The bottom row of this table is a fundoscopy. Those are the very not fun bright light pictures of your retina that you get taken when you have an eye exam. And one of the things they're examining in a fundoscopy is the macula, that portion of the retina, and how it appears. And this is the microscopic anatomy just in schematic in the normal retina and in both types of pathology. So in the normal retina, you have photoreceptors, those rods and cones, sitting happily on an intact epithelium and membrane below. In dry macular degeneration, you get a relatively slow but progressive degeneration of the macula. So rods and cones degenerate. There's inflammatory processes that ensue here. The epithelium that the rods and cones sit on becomes abnormal and atrophic. And there's an accumulation of something called drusen, which are these yellow sort of deposits that are visible on fundoscopy. Now, drusen is one of those weird pathological hallmarks, doesn't necessarily cause macular degeneration, but is associated with it. Wet macular degeneration is quite different. So wet macular degeneration results from new blood vessel growth into the retina. And those blood vessels burst and hemorrhage and leak fluid and into the retina and in the vicinity of photoreceptors, and it results in quite rapid macular degeneration. And so this is a really severe, faster progressing scenario. You can see the difference on fundoscopy. The subretinal hemorrhage, you can see, is visible on fundoscopy as a bleeding, irregular macula. Now, this is just a recent review summarizing risk factors for age-related macular degeneration. And first of all, we'll just fix this. I assume by genders they mean biological sex, so we'll bring this schematic into 2024 and look at some of the risk factors for age-related macular degeneration. Some of them are certainly modifiable, right? So smoking is one. Aging, less modifiable, that's inevitable. But many of them are related to physical activity. Hypertension, obesity, dyslipidemia, which means abnormal lipid profile. Many of these can be reversed or reduced, changed in the right direction through physical activity. So this is just an interesting interaction between age-related eye disease and physical activity. As you can imagine, as you progressively lose vision as you age, it becomes harder and harder to be physically active. People are less likely to engage in physical activity when their vision is impaired. Particularly with macular degeneration, when you lose the ability to see objects right in front of you. So you don't just lose the ability to drive and to read, these activities of daily living, you also probably lose the ability to engage in the physical activities that you once did. And interestingly, these increase the risk of developing age-related eye disease. So this is another one of those cases where changes in vision and loss of physical activity represent a vicious cycle. So we talked about visual acuity and how it changes in the early postnatal life. Now let's talk about binocular vision and depth perception. So coordinated eye movements, our eyes moving together in unison to look at a target, are the basis of binocular vision. And these eye movements are not really coordinated at birth. So strabismus, or a misaligned eye, is present at birth, but recovers in most children as the eye muscles develop and as the visual circuitry of the brain develops. And so this child has strabismus. This is a child who's probably a little bit older than when you would expect strabismus to develop. You can see that this eye is pointing in the right direction and this eye is wandering off medially. And so colloquially you might describe this as being cross-eyed. It can wander in any direction. This happens to be a common one, but strabismus can result with an eye wandering up or down or out in the eye socket. Strabismus just means misaligned eyes. Now, in most children, this recovers over time after birth, But actually, persistent strabismus is one of the most common developmental disorders in childhood. So it has an estimated prevalence internationally of about 4%. Now, one of the mechanisms for strabismus is these 6 small eye muscles. So these are the ones that move the eye in the orbit. Let us look left, right, up, down, etc. And they are not fully developed at birth. So here is that lateral view of the eye we saw before with these muscles attached to the outside of the eyeball. And here's a view of the eyeball from the front showing you those 6 little muscles. And they move the eye in almost predictable directions. So this is a view of the right eye. You're looking at the person face on, so the nose is right here. And you're standing in front of them, so their right is on your left. This medial rectus, for example, pulls the eye this way, toward the nose. And this lateral rectus pulls the eye that way, toward the outside of the head. So in this child that we saw earlier, they have a misaligned eye. The misaligned eye is right here, so that's the normal eye. This is the strabismus eye, and you can see that it's deviating toward the nose. So one mechanism could be, in this child, in that eye, that this muscle, the lateral rectus that pulls the eye away from out toward the outside of the world, toward the outside of the head, is not developed. That's one possible mechanism. However, it's not the only mechanism. So the book sort of says, oh yeah, it's due to weak eye muscles. But it's really important to remember that it can be at any level of the visual system, including the brainstem and the brain as a whole. So the ocular motor nerves and extraocular muscles, those muscles that move the eyeball, are one common mechanism of strabismus, but it can also be what's called a higher strabismus. So strabismus resulting from brain damage or abnormal brain circuitry. So this little diagram shows us what the outcome of strabismus, it's hard to say strabismus is. And when the eyes aren't aligned, we get diplopia or double vision. That's what diplopia means. And so here we've got the normal scenario, both eyes aligned looking at a target, and the brain interprets that as a single target because the input from both eyes is arriving simultaneously. When the input is offset from both eyes because they're not aligned correctly, diplopia is one of the most common outcomes. The brain sees something like this. Now, the terminology is really important here because you hear all these visual deficits in children and they all sort of sound the same but mean slightly different things. So strabismus is eye misalignment. Diplopia is double vision, which is one of the things that results. And there's a third, more persistent condition, which is amblyopia or lazy eye. And amblyopia can result when strabismus occurs and it's untreated, and the brain says, ugh, you know what? I'm just going to ignore the input from this eye because if I take that out, then I get rid of that double vision. And so if you let strabismus run untreated, sort of for prolonged periods of time in a child who doesn't grow out of it, they can develop amblyopia, which is a more persistent condition. And that is just the brain saying, I'm out, ignore that eye. Now, when you try to recognize amblyopia in a kid, the child may not report it, right? So they may not realize they have any trouble seeing, but they might behave to eliminate their double vision. And so you might see them close one eye when they're trying to look at something, or squint. And squinting can be symptoms of other things, but squinting is a symptom. And they might tilt their head because by physically adjusting the position of their head, they can correct the position of their eye and reduce their diplopia. So these are signs that even though a child doesn't report a visual deficit, particularly a young child, they might be experiencing one and compensating for it behaviorally. Now, strabismus used to be treated with an eye patch. So you'd see little kids walking around like pirates. Yar. But they've improved the treatment of strabismus and amblyopia fairly dramatically. This is from Time. This is one of Time's best inventions of 2023, ditching the eye patch, and it's called luminopia is the technology. And they're visual goggles that blur and clarify different portions of a visual field for both eyes to progressively treat these conditions in kids. So they've done two things. They've first, over the eye patch situation, made treatment more effective. And second, they've actually increased the treatment period. So if someone goes through late childhood or adolescence or even into adulthood and with amblyopia, which used to be considered untreatable after young childhood, now with some more recent therapeutic interventions, they are sometimes corrected. I will say that the visual patch, the patch treatment, is still used. It's called occlusion therapy. And actually what happens in occlusion therapy is you patch the normal eye. So the good eye or the strong eye, the non-lazy eye is patched. And that forces children to use the lazy eye. And that can correct amblyopia if it's done early enough. Now, the reason it's crucial to treat visual impairments in children is that visual impairments have a profound effect on all domains of development, and that includes motor development. And so the visual impairment can range in severity from something like a mild amblyopia to blindness or substantial loss of sight. Now, it's important, sometimes it's easy to think of blindness as loss of all visual input, right? So we see blackness. That's actually not often the case. Blindness is officially described as residual distance acuity. So it's not total loss of sight. Legally blind, the definition of legally blind, is visual acuity less than 20/200, even while wearing corrective eyewear. And so less than 20/200, even corrected. So I'm certainly legally blind without my corrective eyewear, but I'm not while wearing it. And that may apply to some of you as well. The impact of visual impairment depends on multiple things. First, the severity of the impairment. That's obvious. There's a huge range of visual impairment, from total loss of sight to relatively minor visual impairments. And also age of onset of the impairment. Loss of sight less than 5 years of age, so either at birth or even in very young age, that is an important factor because it results in a failure to retain usable, visual imagery of the world. So we don't have a visual landscape that we remember to navigate through. And so that's a really profound impact on all domains of development, including motor development. So this table summarizes sort of the median age in months that a child with profound visual impairment achieves motor milestones compared to a child with normal vision. And when we look at these, it really lets us think about the role of vision in movement and motor development. So let's look at elevates self by arms when in the prone position. So if you put a normal baby on their stomach, tummy time, that's the prone position, they lift their head by about 2 or a couple of months. They start to lift their head and look around. And without sight, babies have no motivation to do this. They're not seeing anything above them. All they're feeling is, oh, my face is smashed into the carpet and I don't feel great. So they don't have a visual trigger to lift their head and look around. So typically, that movement is quite delayed. Similarly, there are big delays in independent walking. So look at the differences in those delays. And you can imagine that one of the reasons for that is those babies without the visual input aren't seeing something that they want to get to. They're not motivated. There's no visual cue there. And so when we think about supporting motor development and physical activity in children, and I'll extend it to people with visual impairments, we want to think about things that include using auditory cues to replace visual cues. That's really important. How do you motivate a baby to want to crawl and walk and move in their environment? Well, you call to them, or you signal that a toy is there with an auditory cue. Use something to replace that visual cue. In an older child or an older person, you would use something like a basketball or a soccer ball that provides audio feedback rather than visual feedback. Obviously, extra instruction and practice time are important, and modified equipment that allows this relationship, the cue relationship, to change from primarily visual to primarily audio. One of the things that's really important for parents of small children with visual impairments is they need to use what's called tactile modeling and physical guidance. That means if you put a toy in their hands, you have to teach them physically, manipulating their hands, how they can move and interact with that toy. They don't have the visual input to see other people doing it and emulate that. Right? So the visual aspect of their curiosity is missing, and you have to stimulate that with one of their other senses. Now, of course, it should be no surprise by this time that children with visual impairments are at risk of delays in other developmental domains. So when you're working with a small child with a visual impairment, you're not teaching them to walk and move in their environment to attain these milestones simply to stimulate their ability to move and walk. You're also facilitating their development in these other crucial domains. And that's really important to remember, the relationship between all four domains, and driving one, progression in one drives progression in the others. Now, I think a really important extension of this is the relationship between the senses and the cognitive domain, not only in children, but in older adults. So, there's recent research that has focused on the relationships between age-related eye diseases and cognitive decline, and that includes the risk of dementia. This is a relatively large and recent systematic review that concluded that visual impairment is associated with cognitive decline, cognitive impairment, and dementia. And I think that's really important. We don't yet understand the directional relationship or the mechanism by which loss of vision or visual impairment is associated with cognitive impairment. What we do know is it's not just that both are products of aging. They do confer individual risk. There's an interaction between these two. And that's so much true that visual loss has been added to the Lancet's risk of modifiable age factors for preventing or delaying dementia. And so that happened in 2024, as recently as 24. I'll take you through this little schematic because it's interesting, actually. So the little circles with the percentages indicate the cases of dementia that could be reduced or delayed in the population if this factor was eliminated. So, low education in early life is a risk factor for dementia. It's modifiable. Hearing loss and high cholesterol in midlife, as well as depression, traumatic brain injury, and so on. Those are the midlife modifiable risk factors. And late in life, we have a huge one, which is social isolation, which I think is interesting, and now recently visual loss. And that's a result of really recent findings. So this is another example of a potentially very important interaction between vision and a domain of development. And that isn't happening just early in life. It's actually also happening in aging and older adults, contributing to the risk of dementia.